Well, it's good to be with everyone again. It's been a few Sundays since I got to be here. Go ahead and tell Cody, if you're watching this, I appreciate you coming and filling in last week, or switching Sundays rather, with me. I hadn't got to see Cody in a little bit because he's been preaching somewhere, or I've been preaching somewhere, and sometimes that's a very nice problem to have when you have good friends that are trying to do the Lord's work other places. I really appreciate that. I appreciate all the work that you all do here, and hopefully I can be an encouragement tonight, as I promise you, you all have always been an encouragement to me. This is one of the hardest questions for people to get past in coming to Christ sometimes. Why does a loving God allow the people that He created to suffer? How do you call that good? And I imagine it's probably crossed your minds from time to time whenever you've seen sickness, whenever you've seen evil deeds or natural disasters hit close to home and affect those that you love. Good, solid-hearted people. You can look at Job and think about Job, and I preached a lesson some time back on Job and his two friends, or three friends, or possibly even four friends that could be there in that setting by the end of it. And his friends thought it came because of sin in Job's life. Job believed himself to be unjustly suffering at the hands of God. And so there's a big questioning amongst all of them throughout that entire book, culminating in the very end of God setting Job straight on just how it was, and setting his friends straight on just how it was. God, being the loving God that He is, offers us free will of choice. And so we're going to talk about this idea of why do people suffer tonight. And the reality is that free choice plays a major factor in this. Free choice leaves room for wicked decisions and righteous ones at the same time. We in this society, we love the idea of free speech. We love the idea of freedom. And we're screaming for freedom. We're screaming for people to leave us alone. And we're getting frustrated at the government. But then at the same time, if we're honest with ourselves, there's times where we're like, well, he shouldn't be allowed to say that. She shouldn't be allowed to do that. And so we understand this idea that with freedom, there comes a place for wicked decisions to be made and righteous ones to be made. And that's difficult to deal with. It's difficult for us to recognize that within our own selves, and it's difficult for us to watch that happen out there in the world. Adam and Eve is a great example of this, and we'll talk about Adam and Eve a little bit more later on, but in Genesis chapter 3, they had free will choice whether to obey God or to not obey God. They even had the benefit of being with God in the garden. No suffering to sway their minds. No pain for them to have to deal with. They had everything they needed. But they ultimately chose not to obey. A little side point and to be made right here, something that should tell us that sometimes that when we believe in things getting easier, when things get perfect, that's not the case. It's a pipe dream. Sometimes we seek for that. Well, I'll come back to church whenever work gets a little bit easier. I'll come back to start doing for the Lord whenever I have a family. Or after the kids get out of the house, it's going to be easier for us to... All different kinds of man's reasoning as to when things are going to be perfect, when things are going to be right, when things are going to be easy. And the reality is that Adam and Eve had perfection in the garden, and they still chose not to serve God. So you're never going to have a perfect setting for you to make the right choice. It's never going to be perfect. The only thing that makes it perfect is you having a breath and you having mental functioning brain to make that choice. And I look out in the audience and I say, we have that here tonight. Now's the time to be making a choice like that. We understand that the basic idea of free will is love, after all. God could have forced Adam and Eve to obey Him. He could have worked Adam and Eve like a puppet while they were in that garden. He could have done that. A lot of people in the world today would have you believe that that's how God does it. There's even some people that would consider themselves our brethren in a lot of ways that are starting to lean a lot more towards this idea of a select elect. and predestination. But Adam and Eve had a choice from the very beginning of mankind. Man had a choice as to whether they were going to be righteous, as to whether they were going to be right before God, or whether they weren't. God was not forcing them to say, I love you. You ever hear that from a kid? Sometimes you'll have a kid and they'll be playing and messing around at grandma's house and you'll tell them, say, okay, it's time to go. I don't want to. It's time to go. Go tell grandma that you love her. No, I don't want to. I want to stay here. They get so mad. And then they'll finally just stomp up to grandma and say, well, I love you, and then leave. And then there's other times to where when you're leaving the house that they go, no, I don't want to leave Nana's house. That's what's about to happen here in just a few more hours at our family. I don't want to leave Nana's house. I love you. I love you. There's a big difference in the two. Big difference in being forced to say I love you and choosing to say I love you. God's not forcing us to say I love you, but boy, is He not giving us every reason to love Him. You think about Joshua, and at the end of the book of Joshua, after they've conquered the land, Joshua stands before these people who should have had every right to agree with him. He stands before the people and says, choose for you whom this day you will serve in Joshua 24. As for me and my house, and we sing this song, we will serve the Lord. And the people said, that sounds good to us too. They had choice. They had free choice. They were given every reason to, but they had free choice. Paul in Romans chapter 7, speaking to the war of sin that rages inside of him, says that even with the battles that he might be having within himself, that his body wants to do one thing, but his mind knows to do something else, he says, I am striving to choose righteousness. It's not just something that just automatically happens. It's not something that's just going to come easy to you. But it's something you have to strive for. All through Acts, people had the choices as to whether to obey the gospel or not. Nobody was forced to obey the gospel. We don't read of anybody being held at weapon point to obey the gospel. They had the choice to obey the gospel. Choice is a beautiful thing. But sadly, the reality is, and this plays such a factor in human suffering, the reality is that unrighteous choices are still there to be made. They're still there to be made. Another point that really needs to be considered, and I almost could end the lesson right here, is Satan is to blame for this suffering. And for many different ways in which Satan is to blame for this suffering. It's easy in one sense to see his involvement. After all, who tempted Adam and Eve to sin in the garden? What got them put out of the garden? Thus, who aided the ushering in of sin and suffering? They were living just fine with God until temptation via Satan appeared. In 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8, Peter says there, be sober of spirit, be on alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion seeking someone to devour. Folks, it was never God's plan for humans to suffer. You need to understand, it wasn't God's plan for humans to suffer. But the love of free choice and the separation because of sin leaves the blame ultimately to mankind. It's tough to say and tough to hear when sometimes there's little that we can do about our suffering. And we'll speak to some of those here in just a little bit. But it can serve a very godly purpose. Something else we'll speak to by the end of this lesson. But first, let's consider some of the whys. And I don't necessarily want to claim that this is all comprehensive of why people suffers. But here's some biblical reasons that I conceive of why people suffer and why we go through some sufferings. I encourage any of you all, help me add to this list if you can come up with some other ways. But the first one that I want to point out is this. Sometimes it's because of personal sin that we suffer. Adam and Eve being the first example of that. In in Genesis chapter 3, they listened to Satan's lies. They sinned against God. And they were put out of the garden. That alone was a trial. That alone was suffering, to be put out of the garden, to be put out of perfection, to be put out from being in the exact presence of God. We all understand that, right? We are in the presence of God in this world that we live in, but not like Adam and Eve were. Not like we're going to be in heaven one day. That alone was suffering, to be put away from God. But read verses 16. To the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall deliver children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he shall rule over you. Then to Adam he said, because you have listened to the voice of your wife, and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. Cursed is the ground because of you. With hard labor you shall eat from it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles shall grow for you, yet you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread until you return to the ground, because from it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. God's really putting Adam and Eve back into their place. You see, that's part of that decision-making process that can happen, is when you start to get a little bit too big for your britches in making your decisions, and you start to not follow after God and think your decisions are much better, something's going to happen to come help put you back in your place. Adam got put back in his place with those last few words right there. You are dust, Adam. I made you. You're dust. We need to remember that in our society, and quite frankly, some of us in this building, probably all of us, need to be reminded of that. You're dust, and guess what? You're going to return back to dust. Now, what you do in between that start and that finish is going to play a huge factor in how the end turns out. But God puts him back in his place. Their sin separated them from God. Their sin. They couldn't place it all on the devil. Now, he did tempt them, but they're the ones that made the decision. Their sin separated them from God, and that alone brought about the trials of life on earth. Simple decisions have to bring about difficulty sometimes for there to ever be a correction made. It's not a hard and fast, but sometimes your personal sin that comes upon you are going to have repercussions, and we hate that. But if we're honest with ourselves, sometimes that's a good thing, to help us recognize that is not how I should be living. That is not how I should be acting. The entire book of Judges deals with this idea. The people would leave God into sin. God would send an oppressor or a punisher, and then the people would cry out in remorse, and God would send their deliverer by the way of one of the judges. All because of their sin. All because they stepped away from God. They would have kept living righteous before God. They wouldn't have had any punishment sent to them. But because they walked away from God, it come upon them. King David's sin led to many different trials in his life. Not just at the time, but even through the rest of his life. In 1 Peter chapter 4, Peter is making the point that brethren would go through earthly sufferings. And he makes this point when he says this in verse 15, make sure that none of you suffers as a murderer or a thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler. What's his point? His point is that if you live this kind of way, suffering is going to come upon you. Do you understand what that means? I've heard different people different times sit there and go, why am I suffering? And I look at them and I kind of just want to tell them, well, it's because you ran out on your wife. That's why you're suffering. It's because you have given yourself over to alcohol. That's why you're suffering. It's because you have a nasty, wicked attitude towards everyone in business. That's why you're suffering. There's some times where there's no wonder why you are suffering. You've brought it on yourself. And that's what Peter says right here. Sometimes your suffering happens because of your poor decisions. And you have to be willing to see that and admit that. Stop blaming other people, and most certainly stop blaming God. That's an important point that I want us to get by looking through all of these. Every time we want to point the finger back to God for our sufferings, really it needs to be pointed somewhere else. Because He's the one that's actually trying to help you in your sufferings. He's the only lifeline that we truly have in this world to help us in our sufferings. Don't point it at God. Sometimes you have to point it back at yourself. We use the phrase, the chickens have come home to roost, as a way of making this point sometimes. point being that sometimes the life which we have chosen to live brings about repercussions that we ain't necessarily going to like. But you better be ready for it, because they are coming. When considering our own suffering, it would be very helpful to consider if we may be at any of the fault for it at first. And I think that can be dangerous, because I do think sometimes our suffering happening to us is one of these other reasons. And when we want to place it on ourselves, really we can't do much about it. And that can be damaging to somebody. So I want to give that caveat. But I do think that it's probably helpful and healthy when we are going through something to stop and say, okay, did I bring this on myself? Is there something that I am doing and a way in which I'm acting that is making me feel this way, that is making me experience this thing? Because it could be the case, and you could really do yourself a lot of service by fixing what's going wrong in your life, by fixing the problems, by fixing the sin that is happening in your life. Don't always come because of sinful, bad decisions either. I think that's some things that people often think. You may have just made a bad business decision. Doesn't have anything to do with it being a sinful business decision. Y'all understand that, right? Doesn't have anything to do with it being sinful. It may have just been a bad one. That could cause some great frustrations. Maybe it is a bad attitude that you have. Maybe not even a sinful attitude, but maybe just a poor manner in which you carry yourself that may be bringing about some of the suffering that's happening in your life. Wrong choices. You may have multiple choices about a path to take in life. And it may not be a sinful path, but it just might be the wrong path. So sometimes it's just poor decisions that's not even sinful decisions that you personally make. Might I suggest to you that that's when books like Proverbs are really helpful. That's when leaning on our brethren, leaning on those with gray hair that Proverbs speaks so much about, are very helpful, so that when you're making decisions, you may do a good job about not making a sinful decision, but you may be aided by those people that know better to help you not make just a bad decision. And it could save you from some of that suffering that could lead you away from God if you will allow it to. But sometimes it's not your sin. Sometimes it is the sin of other people. I think about that generation of people that wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. Do you realize that the people wandering in the wilderness wasn't just the people that physically said, hey, we don't want you, Moses. We don't want you, Aaron. I think about that 10-year-old that could have been standing around in earshot of what they were doing, and they heard them sitting there talking about how, well, they don't like Moses and Aaron anymore. They definitely don't like Joshua and Caleb. Oh, apparently Mom and Dad says we're going to hightail it back to Egypt. Okay, I see how that goes. Oh, wait, no, we're not. No, we're not. God said that ain't what we're doing. God says now, because of what Mama and Grandmama did, because of what Daddy and Granddaddy did, now I've got to go wander in the wilderness too. Sometimes we have things happen to us because of other people's sin. I think about Achan in Joshua chapter 7 and how they fought that battle of Jericho, and what were they told? They were told, do not take anything in this battle. Everything, all the plunder goes to God. Any of the plunder he has goes to God. Achan decided he was going to take a little bit. They go and they fight against that little old city Ai. And Ai beats them. And they go, what gives, God? Joshua says, we did what you told us to do. And he said, not all of you. And that's when they go and figure out Achan sinned. Achan's sin caused the children of Israel to lose that battle. They weren't the ones that took stuff. I don't think that they saw Achan like, well, we ain't going to try Achan, but good for you. You go take that and put it in your tent. No, he snuck it into his tent, and his sin caused everybody else problems. As soon as they dealt with it the way God told them to deal with it, they went through Ai like they were nothing. And honestly, they went on to have no problems from there on out because they obeyed God, because they got rid of that. Hardship brought on by someone else's sin sometimes is going to cause us problems too. And I do want to make it clear, Ezekiel 18:20, the person who sins will die. We need to understand that. A son will not suffer the punishment for the father's guilt, nor will a father suffer the punishment for the son's guilt. When it comes to God, when it comes to spiritually, if my dad sins, I'm not going to pay the brunt for that. If I sin, he's not going to pay the brunt for that. But I tell you what, and every one of us knows this to be true, my daddy could ruin my name for me before I ever got a chance to ruin it. I could ruin Harper's name for her before she ever gets a chance to ruin it. We can cause other people great harm by the actions that we commit. There are so many people that has their lives put in great hardship because of decisions that other people have made surrounding them. Don't place that on God. Place that back where it belongs, on sin, on Satan, on selfishness. You think about 9/11 and how terrible that was. And how these men that were on those planes made that wicked decision. And even though they thought that it wasn't a wicked decision, they made that wicked decision. And it led to so much heartache and so much pain for so many people all over this nation. Folks, when you hear of anyone sinning, you need to understand something. We love this idea that we can sin and that only affects us. But that's not true. It's never true. You affect so many other people. I don't know how many times that churches, congregations, family are ripped and torn apart because someone else sinned. How many times that brethren can be at each other's throats over certain subjects because somebody else sinned. Sometimes our suffering, sometimes our problems comes because of other people's bad mistakes. Bad decisions, affairs tearing up families and churches, murder taking not just one life but completely altering so many other lives that had nothing at all to do with that sin. Lying, cheating, stealing, putting burdens on those that have been duped, all of which should be none of us. So we need to realize sometimes the suffering that may be going on in our lives are because of other people's sin. Sometimes it's just natural law. Well, you just think simply about the law of gravity. The law of gravity is pretty unforgiving, isn't it? Hey, some of us had already experienced that probably many different times. I don't know how many times I trip whenever I'm in the woods and I fall. Well, I don't just float in there and go, whew, that was a close one. No, gravity takes me all the way down. Sometimes suffering is just natural law that happens. You think about the law of time and aging. Ecclesiastes chapter 12 speaks in beautiful language, or maybe not so beautiful in some people's minds, depending on how close it resembles you. But Ecclesiastes 12 speaks to the pains of aging and how all the many different things that starts to happen to your body as you get older. In the very early part, what does it say? It says, young man, you need to remember the days of your youth. You need to live well the days of your youth. You need to enjoy them. Not in some kind of living frivolously, but in recognizing by the end of 12 to fear God and keep His commandments. Start that when you're young, because as you get older, it gets harder and harder and harder to do the things that you know to do, that you want to do, that you need to do. Sometimes it's natural law. Paul speaks about his tent becoming worn out, and how in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 5, for we know that if our earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made by hands, eternal in the heavens. For indeed in this tent we groan, longing to be clothed with our dwelling from heaven, since in fact after putting it on we will not be found naked. For indeed we who are in this tent groan, being burdened, because we do not want to be unclothed, but to be clothed, so that what is mortal shall be swallowed up by mortals, shall be swallowed up by life. Even mortality is a natural law that causes great suffering. There's no greater suffering that I've seen out of people than when they have to deal with death that happens in family. Whether it's a spouse, whether it's a child, whether it's a father or a grandmother, that's some of our greatest sufferings that we can have to go through, is especially the initial dealing with mortality. In Luke chapter 7, Jesus sees that widow who has just lost her son, and she's a widow, so that means she lost her husband. So she lost a husband, then she lost a son, and it says that He felt compassion for her, so he raised that child up from the dead for her. Now, Jesus gets to supersede that natural law, but he recognizes just how much suffering that can cause on somebody. Sometimes natural law is going to lead towards suffering because we are all appointed to die. And then comes the judgment. And then there's the one that we all hate. The one that we really wish didn't exist, but it's going to exist in this realm of free choice, and that is time and chance. Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11, the ecclesiastical writer says, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, that the battle is not to the warrior, and neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to the skillful, for time and chance overtake them all. This is a great difficulty that many of us don't like to have to experience as human beings. But with free choice, by very definition, it has to be there. Dealing with time and chance. If there was no free will, then there would be no time and chance for the ecclesiastical writer to speak of. You realize that? If we were all just living perfectly in the garden, there wouldn't be a reason for time and chance. But because we have left the Lord, because we have walked out on Him, that's brought things like time and chance and difficulties into this world. Jesus makes this point over in Luke chapter 13 when He is asked by some people over there, because again, that idea of Job's friends, it didn't just stop with Job, but it still is present, and I would dare say that some of us that really question whether or not this is actually the way that life works. But listen to what's said over in Luke 13. Now on that very occasion there were some present who reported to him about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. And Jesus responded to them and said to them, do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans, just because they have suffered this fate? No, I tell you, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Is he saying they're going to have their bloods mixed with sacrifices? No. Or do you think that those 18 whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them were worse offenders than all the other people who live in Jerusalem? No, I tell you, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. Like I said, the Jewish people had a common belief that if something bad happened to you, then that must be an indication of sin. Same way Job's friends had that same mindset. That must mean you've sinned. I think we struggle with that still today. I think when we have something bad happen to us, we think, well, I must have done something wrong, or we want to blame God, or we put God directly as the one that caused it. Just the same way that we do it the opposite way too, don't we? Something good happens, well, I must be living right. That must mean that God's pleased with me. No. There's a lot of good things that happens to people in our world today that they are not living for God at all. And so the truth has to be both ways. Jesus is basically telling them here, no, that was time and chance. But I tell you what's not time and chance, Jesus says, and that's your death. You may not all die like the Galileans. You may not die like the 18 that had the tower fall on them in Siloam, but you are going to die. That is going to happen. You all will likewise perish. So what do you need to do? You need to repent. You need to repent. That same message is for us today. We are going to have good things happen to us. We're going to have bad things happen to us. What's our responsibility though? Repent. Because there is one thing that is going to happen, and that's death. Death is a surety that is going to happen to us. Good things may happen, bad things may happen. Time and chance happen to them all. But death definitely is going to happen to us all. Things might just happen. I had a friend die not too long ago in kind of a freak car accident. He was barely crossing the intersection. A police officer was barely pulling out of that intersection, and they hit, probably going no more than 5-10 miles per hour. His airbag exploded, and part of the apparatus exploded and caught him under the neck and pretty well killed him almost instantly. He was on his way to church. He was about a half second from being in the East Side parking lot in Bowling Green, Kentucky. going to study and going to worship with his brethren like he always did. Now, you think he deserved that? You think God said, oh, how dare you be going to church tonight? You think that's how it happened? Folks, time and chance happens to us all. You know what his responsibility was? His responsibility was to be right before God so that when something happens, when time and chance happens, you're going to be ready to meet him. Sometimes our suffering is just time and chance, as much as that is hard to hear. People getting caught up in some of these terrible mass shootings because they literally were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They didn't deserve that. But that's what sin has brought on. That's what free will brings on. Such a bleak lesson. So I don't really want to leave it on that note. You may be able to help me recognize that there could be some nuances and some other ways and reasons why we suffer. I don't doubt that at all. But I want to kind of leave it with this. There are benefits to our suffering if we will allow ourselves to benefit from it. It's hard to in the moment sometimes, but hopefully at some point you can see the benefits. The first benefit that I want to mention is this. It helps us to realize that this world is not our home. I tell you what, there's things that happen. There are people that do wicked things on a national level, on a personal level, and I think things are going good, and then all of a sudden the brakes get stomped on, and it helps me to recognize this world is not my home. It gets easy to get really comfortable here. It gets easy to love and enjoy living life, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't. But we do need these reminders. I'm telling you, every one of us needs these reminders that this world is not our home. As the song says, we're just passing through. Whether you like it or not, you're just passing through. Whether you are a pilgrim headed towards God or you're trying to run away from Him, you are just a passing through. Where are your treasures laid up? Psalm 18:6, in my distress I called upon the Lord and cried to my God for help, and He heard my voice from His temple. And my cry for help before Him came into my ears. In his distress, where did he go? To the Lord. We sing a song, I can't remember if it's in this book or not. Where should I go but to the Lord? There was some time back whenever, I think it was right when, maybe when COVID was starting to happen. Is that when the tornado hit Cookeville? We had the tornado that hit Cookeville. We had COVID that was starting to pick up, and people were starting to get a little bit concerned about what that might or might not be. And we had another brother that was dealing with a very terrible, or another sister that was dealing with a very terrible cancer and was just about to pass away. So many things happened. The Cookeville tornado hit, and there was multiple people at that east side that had multiple people that had been killed in that tornado, and they hadn't found them yet. And we got together and we had a prayer service. And I remember one of the things that was said whenever they were talking, whenever Bob was talking to his son about all the different things. Yeah, this is going on, that's going on, that's going on. We're going to have a prayer service. He said, well, the only song that comes to my mind is, where should I go but to the Lord? That's what suffering can bring us to if we will allow it. It can bring us back to the Lord. It can bring us back, and I think a lot of people struggled with that during COVID because there was a lot of people that thought they had control of their life, then all of a sudden they realized they didn't. That should have woken people up. Instead, I think it woke people up in the wrong direction. But it should have woken people up that you're not in control, but God is in control. Sometimes that's what suffering can help us to see. Sometimes suffering can help us reevaluate ourselves. You know, you need to do that. You need to look inwardly sometimes, especially when we go back to that idea of personal suffering. That idea that sometimes the reason why we're suffering is because of us and our decisions. I've had different friends go through a divorce and have difficulty dealing with that. And one of the best things that they did for themselves was to stop and have to ask themselves, where all were my faults in this? And to come away recognizing that they weren't perfect and they needed to change that. They needed to fix that. Sometimes these things, these terrible things that happen, you may have a hand in them, you may not. Regardless if you have a hand in them or not, there's times where it can really help you reevaluate you, your attitude, and how you're living your life. We should have become more aware of what is important to us and what is not. It goes back to that idea. When that terrible thing happens and you start to go through that suffering, do you run to God or do you run away from God? It's easy to come to church services. It's easy to sing, "Oh, happy day," whenever you come to church services and things are going well. But what about when things get tough? James lets us know in James chapter 1 that trials will come. He doesn't say if trials come. He says when trials come. All of us are going to have moments in our life that are going to be difficult to deal with. And James's plea, and really his whole book is really speaking to it, but his plea in those first 4 verses is, what are you going to do about it? Well, what you need to do about it is, it's going to strengthen you to God or it's not. That goes back to free choice, doesn't it? Free choice as to how you are going to allow these things to affect you. And I think something else that we can see from these benefits is that sometimes it can bring the best out in us. And sometimes we can see the good in other people. I think about the song, "You Find Out Who Your Friends Are." And how you think you know who's your friend, but when you go through that stressful time, when you go through that suffering, that's when you really know who's there for you. They're the ones that's going to call. They're the ones that's going to try to do for you. Are you going to bite the hand that's trying to feed you, or are you going to realize who your friends are? Are you going to realize who's trying to be there for you? Are you going to be that type person? I think about 9/11 and all the many different stories of what strangers were doing for strangers during all of that. We think about that even when we have a 2-inch snow around here, about what people are willing to go and willing to do for you. That you realize that, well, I've got a 4-wheel drive, so I'm going to call, see if any of the elderly ladies need help. Need me to go get the snow off the driveway, or make sure that I can go get the last piece of bread that's left on the counter. Last drop of milk. Folks, we bite and devour one another, but when a tornado hits or a hurricane hits, sometimes that's when we can see the true nature of people, and I can appreciate that. To help us recognize that we ain't all bad. We like to think certain people, oh, he's just bad. He's just wicked. We ain't all bad. I wish we could learn our lessons and benefit from our suffering, because I tell you what, if we would, then maybe there would be less suffering. You ever thought about that? If all of us would learn our lessons from suffering, if you take the whole wide world would learn our lessons from suffering, then it would really change a lot of things, wouldn't it? It would change a whole lot. If we would learn that even within our group, that it would make it a place, as I hope that it is, and you're the only ones that can speak to it, to where when you're going through your suffering, you know you can come to Walton's Chapel and be with brethren. You know you can call up brethren on the phone and get some strength and get some encouragement. But if nothing else, the one thing that we have to realize is that we can't get that strength and encouragement to God. Folks, if there's nothing else that I help you to understand, I want you to understand this. Suffering does not come from God. When you want to start putting the blame on God for any difficulty that's going on in your life, you need to look somewhere else. When you look at God, you need to look at the one place in this entire world that can ease that suffering, because He's it. Jesus Christ crucified is it. That's the only place you can go to get alleviated from true suffering. Because, as we talked about and as we sing, this world is not our home. We're just passing through. We have to recognize that. We have to believe that. We have to make that an important part of our lives. Because if we don't, I think we just keep getting lost. And we're going to keep dealing with suffering. And we're not going to be able to deal with the difficulties whenever they do come, because we've not got our focus where our focus needs to be, and that's heaven. So I've heard Gary Henry say different times, the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. And the main thing is trying to get to heaven. Are you keeping that as your goal? Because when these difficulties hit, when this suffering hits, you know you can go to God. If you're here tonight, you may be dealing with a time of great suffering. You may be dealing with a time that is going to really make you question things. I think if there's one thing that I learned from Job, I don't know that God is upset with us about us wondering and questioning things. Not in one sense. I think it's when we start making charges towards God. I think that's where the problem gets to be had at. Asking God why, trying to gain understanding, that's one thing. But when you start telling God what's what, and Job started to do a little bit of that, that's when God gets a little bit upset. Don't place this on God. Place it where it belongs. Place it on sin. Place it on Satan. And realize that God is not the one causing the suffering. God is the one that can give the only aid to the suffering. If you're here tonight, we ask that you don't deal with that any longer. You put away your sin. You put away living a life of unrighteousness towards God. And you start living for God. That's when you can start understanding how to deal with any of the pains here on this earth, because there's something greater that you get to look forward to. The Bible's full of so many people that was living pretty miserable lives, but they found great hope in Jesus Christ crucified. If you're here tonight, let us help you in any way. If it's baptism, if you need to ask for prayers of the saints, whatever it is, we need to talk more about it. Let us do that now as we stand and as we sing.